have never studied it. And a lot of times when I call the name of the book, they don't know whether to start the back, the front, or the side. It's 5 chapters, rich as cream, the book of Lamentations, called The Tears of Jeremiah in the Septuagint translation. I'm having a little trouble with my throat. It doesn't hurt, but it hurts to hear it. But we'll try to talk up and make it make sense. Just returned from 2 meetings in a row, Sunday through Wednesday and Thursday through Sunday in Kentucky. And I spoke 9 times at one place and 8 at the other. Most of them are in the hospital now. But we're here to study a book that's seldom studied. And in the Septuagint translation, the one that Christ and the apostles quoted from many times, the Old Testament Hebrew translated into the Koine, common man Greek, Septuagint translation calls Lamentations the Tears of Jeremiah. He's called the weeping prophet, and this book tells us why he wept. It probably gives the greatest spotlight on this man that you could ever find. It's really a great book, but it's little known. Jeremiah weeps over Jerusalem. He's up high on a vantage point, and he sees the temple go up in smoke and the people wending their way down into 70 years of captivity. It breaks his heart, but the people themselves are flippant about it. They don't really care. And of all the group that left, just a small remnant ever repented and were prepared to come back from captivity and rebuild the temple and restudy the law and be rejuvenated for the coming of Christ. But he, the righteous one, weeps, and the unrighteous people don't care. In Lamentation 1:12, the key verse of that first chapter, he said, "Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Or don't you care that you're going into bondage in a heathen land?" He cared and God cared, but they didn't care. In chapter 2, verse 16, he said, "And the enemies of God are laughing and saying, 'This is the day we waited for. We waited for you to self-destruct. We knew that your God was a just God, and if you sinned grievously, it'd send you away into bondage. And this is the day we waited for. We couldn't defeat you. You defeated yourself. You've been your own worst enemy.'" And then the high mark in Lamentation, the passage we ought to all memorize, is chapter 3, verse 40 and 41. "Let us search and try our ways and turn again to Jehovah. Let us lift up our hearts with our hands unto God in heaven." In other words, take an inward, honest, introspective look at yourself. It's like 2 Corinthians 13:5. "Examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. Prove your own selves lest you be reprobate." So 1:12, 2:16, 3:40, 41, and then 4 verse 5 is the most ironic verse, maybe in the Old Testament. "You went from riches to rags. You were raised in scarlet. You wound up in the garbage dump." And so they went backwards and not forward, chapter 7 of Jeremiah says. And they wound up in captivity. It's one thing to go from rags to riches. There's even a popular song with that title. But for them to go from riches to rags proved they were their own worst enemy. Then in chapter 5, verse 7, he makes the point that our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. Not the guilt of their sins, but the repercussions and consequences of their sins. And then he makes the point, but we're just as guilty. We are sinful like they were. We followed in the path that would not work. Now that gives you the background to Lamentations, and that follows 52 chapters in Jeremiah. But I want us to notice some background to Lamentations. Let's see if we can figure out why they wound up in tears. What was there about their lifestyle and their background and what they may have inherited by way of consequences that produced such a mournful, sad, tearful book? I really believe the story begins in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel, when the people said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." And when people begin thinking like that, they become arrogant, self-reliant, and do not have the humility to serve God. And so in Genesis 11, we have somewhat the background to this book of Lamentations. When men try to make a name for themselves, they get in trouble. The next stanza on that song would be Numbers 14:4. After the 12 men had come back from the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and 10 of the 12 said, "We cannot take it." Only Joshua and Caleb said, "We're well able to take it. Let us rise up at once and take it." And incidentally, those were the only 2 out of 603,550 that entered the promised land. The rest perished in the wilderness of sin because of their disobedient and lack of humble attitude. So let's make a name for ourselves. And then in Numbers 14:4, believe it or not, the people said, let's make us a captain to lead us back to Egypt. They'd already been delivered from Pharaoh and the bondage in Egypt, but they longed to go back there. And they looked back to that, like Lot's wife did in Genesis chapters 18 and 19. And we're told to remember Lot's wife in Luke 17:32. But they said, let's make us a captain to lead us back to Egypt, and when you want a captain, it won't be long till you want a king. It just works that way. Apostasy keeps on going. 2 Timothy 3:13 says, evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. I'm asked many times, do you think the apostasy that has overwhelmed churches of Christ in the last few years is ever going to go away? No. Because the more apostate people become, the more uncomfortable they are with truth. I've studied the Restoration movement and all religious movements going back to the 1st century, and they never ever got better. The majority kept on going into the dregs of sin and the depths of apostasy. It just works that way. Even in the Restoration movement of the early 1800s in the United States on the Western Reserve of America, they just kept on. At one time, all brethren were together, and then they had instrumental music, women preachers, missionary society, and you just name it. It just kept on getting worse and worse and worse and worse. When I lived in Australia for 3 years, there's a group called the Associated Churches of Christ, and you might as well put over them Disciples of Christ. They're like the liberal Christian church. In fact, the preachers among them that I talked to were worse than the most liberal denominational preachers like the Episcopalians, for instance. They, if anything, had a lesser regard for the Bible than those people. It just works that way. When you turn your back upon God and the Bible, and you no longer try to prove things with thus saith the Lord, there's only one way you can go, and that's clear out the back door and keep on going. Someone says, well, that's sort of a pathetic, mournful tale. It's a true one, though. I'm just telling the truth. And the sooner that those who are in apostasy mark themselves, and the more they divide from us, the more I like it. I wish they'd come back, but they're not going to. I like it when liberals that are not going to follow the Bible call themselves the community church or something like that. That's good. But see, some of them have such devious ways, they delight in apostasy. And they do their best to make us look like a bunch of country bumpkins. But if that's what I'm called for following the Bible, they can call me that twice or 100 times. But I do not believe there's anything in the Bible, in human history, in religious history, that would ever say the majority are ever going to come back. And we need to just take a stand for truth. If that means we wind up with 10 people who are faithful and loyal, I'd rather be with 10 loyal ones than 10,000 that went along for the ride. So I don't worry about what people do. I'm concerned about the New Testament church. I was asked recently, and they even put it on tape at World Video Bible School, do you see only gloom and doom on the horizon? I said, not for the New Testament church. Not for the church or even out in the Bible. The Lord said it'd never be destroyed. Once established, it'd stand forever. And even the bars of death could not hold it back. If you're talking about the New Testament church, I have great optimism for that. If you're talking about a movement of men based on a restoration movement, and Campbell and Stone and O'Kelly and others, names they cherish, I don't have much regard for what's going to happen to such a movement. But if you're talking about the New Testament church, the seed of the kingdom is the Word of God, Luke 8:11. And as long as it stands, and that'll be from now on, we're in good shape. You see, the seed of the kingdom is not the restoration movement. We're not trying to restore the restoration movement. We're trying to restore New Testament Christianity. And that's the point. That's a beautiful story there. For the Lord said that we'd always bear fruit after the seed that we sow. So let's just be sure we sow the pure seed and don't worry about, quote, the brotherhood, unquote. In fact, we're not to search the brotherhood to see if these things are so. We're to search the scriptures to see if they're so. Acts 17:11. So as long as we go back to the source and document what we believe by that, we're in good shape. But if we begin comparing brethren and the restoration movement and what they're doing in Timbuktu or Toronto, that'll be another matter. So what does the Bible say? What about the congregation I'm a member of right here, right now? That's the way we ought to view it. But let's make us a captain, at least back to Egypt. Well, did they ever go further than that? 1 Samuel 8, give us a king, that we may be like the nations round about us. And there'll always be members of the kingdom of God that want to be like others round about us. They do not have the pattern of New Testament Christianity. They've wandered from that a long time ago. And so they pick up the accoutrements and the flamboyance of religious movements outside the New Testament, and they want to ape them, mock them. So when you even think like that, you know, when the busing craze and the puppet craze came, where did we get that from? The New Testament? And we got it from the denomination down the street that's packing people in with putting candy under a certain seat that was a secret seat. And we brought people in under those kind of arrangements, bribing them to come. Well, it didn't take very long till most of those buses were just glorified babysitters. Parents stayed home and pushed their kids out in the street. We took care of them for a couple of hours, and that's all they got. Now, if they'd just gotten the Word of God, that'd be another matter. But when we try this peripheral stuff, we're in trouble. And that really is the way some people still think. We need to be recognized as the big cheese. We've got to get in this. And so up in Tennessee, at a big congregation that claimed it was on the march, they'd invite the governor, who wasn't even a Christian, to come and speak. They would have a greased pig contest. They'd have a circus. They'd bring in giraffes and monkeys and those kind of things, and they put it in the front page of the papers outside Nashville. And they were really a church on the march, but on the march to what and where? Discontent with just plain vanilla Bible teaching. They had to have tutti frutti. Vanilla wouldn't work with them. And this is the background to the book of Lamentations. Let's make a name for ourselves. Let's make a captain least back to Egypt. Give us a king that we may be like the nations round about us. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, now, did he make all this up, and is he making too much over this? Well, would you read Psalm 106, verse 15? God granted them their request, but sent leanness into their souls. See, he won't force us to ask for New Testament Christianity. We can be gullible. We can be modernistic. We can want all the entrapment of sectarianism. And he won't force us not to, but he will not approve of it. And Hosea 13:11 says it even better. He gave them a king in his anger, but took him away in his wrath. That's pretty strong, isn't it? And so Lamentations came about. The tears of Jeremiah flowed because of these apostate attitudes. In Jeremiah 6, well, let's go to Jeremiah 5:30 and 31 first. The prophets prophesy falsely. The priests follow their example, and the people love to have it so. In Isaiah 30, verse 10, a century earlier, they said, speak to us smooth things. Tickle our ears, 2 Timothy 4, 1-5. Scratch us where we itch. Do what is palatable to us. That concept. So in Jeremiah 6:16, he gets down to nitty-gritty. He said, stand in the way and seek the old paths, wherein is the good way, and walk therein. But they said, we will not walk therein. The next chapter, chapter 7, 23-28. This is a nation that obeyeth not God. They went backward and not forward. And they went all the way forward to Babylonian captivity for 70 years. They had earned it, they deserved it, they got it. So let's make a name for ourselves. Let's get us a captain leads back to Egypt. Give us a king, that we may be like the nations round about us. We don't want to walk in the old paths. We're going to be disobedient. In Hosea 5:10, the same era of time that Isaiah spoke in, 7th century before Christ, he said, leave the landmarks alone. That's pretty plain. Hosea 5:10. In Proverbs 22:28, he said, remove not the ancient landmarks which our fathers have set. But ever since then, people have tried to remove the landmarks. Do you understand what he's talking about landmarks? Hosea's account, in some translation, speak of the boundaries of land. The most capricious thing a person could do was to move the boundaries of his land over into another fellow's land. He would extend just overnight his land area by cheating, by robbing, by stealing. They say over in Ireland and Scotland, where they have these rock or stone fences, that for years and years a neighbor would get up about midnight or 2 o'clock in the morning and get his workers, and they'd move the other people's stones and push theirs past them. And the next morning they'd wake up with more land than they had before by cheating their neighbor. God is saying, don't you move the landmarks, the boundaries I've set. Stay within the confines of what I've arranged. Learn to not go beyond the things that are written. 1 Corinthians 4:6. If you go beyond the doctrine of Christ, you have neither the Father nor the Son. 2 John verses 9-11. Leave the landmarks alone. We don't need to change anything of New Testament Christianity. We just need to get back to it. But we'll always have those folk who have the modern concept of let's be popular, let's be successful in our own definition of success. But the Lord just said, be faithful, and I'll give you a crown of life. Revelation 2:10. But that doesn't suit some people. They want to help God out. They don't believe the parable of the mustard seed. That's too small. That's not bodacious enough, as Snuffy Smith used to say. But we need to stay within the boundaries and not go beyond them. And you young men here, young women are the hope. I hope you're really listening. This is serious matters. I read a book this last week in Kentucky, about a 600-page book, about what's happened to New Testament Christianity in the last 50 years. How churches of Christ have changed in the last half century. And anyone that knows anything about the history of the church and the movements of men within it can see the accuracy of that and the seriousness of that. We need to be dedicated to the restoration of New Testament Christianity and not even be concerned about aping or being like the denominational world. And so this is the background of the tears of Jeremiah. This is why he lamented. And the people have come full circle and were getting what they deserve. Alienation from God because of their own actions. And so I think the book of Lamentations is a rich and rare book indeed. You remember James and John in Mark chapter 10 and Matthew 20, the parallel accounts? James and John and their mother, who was related to Mary, the mother of Jesus, came to Jesus and said, when you come in your kingdom, envisioning an earthly kingdom with physical prowess and earthly domain, when you come in your kingdom, let one of us sit on your right hand and the other on your left. They got exactly what they asked for, but it wasn't what they had in mind. James, who wanted to get very near the Lord and his kingdom, thinking it to be an earthly kingdom with financial benefits, realized it was a spiritual kingdom, a rule and reign in the hearts and lives of men and women, which you cannot force yourself into. Luke chapter 17. It didn't take it by observation. And this James, who wanted a special place near the Lord and his kingdom, got what he asked for. He was beheaded by Herod in Acts chapter 12. He got real near the Lord and his kingdom. Jesus said, I have a baptism, be overwhelmed with it you're not able to receive. In other words, the baptism of suffering, the overwhelming of suffering. Now, you don't know what you're asking. He even said that you don't know what you're asking. But they thought they did. And all the other apostles, just in the shadow of his ascension, said, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? They had the same concept. Judas Iscariot did too. He wanted to transfer from being the holder of the bag, which was small, into being the secretary of treasury in the greatest earthly kingdom and empire the world ever seen. And when he realized it wasn't going to be that kind of kingdom, as much as he loved money, he threw the 30 pieces of silver, $17 of our money, in front of the priest and went out and hanged himself. And so we've had through the years people that wanted special preeminence. Well, how about John, who wanted to be near the Lord and his kingdom? He was exiled in the Isle of Patmos for tribulation in the kingdom. Revelation 1, 9 and 10. He got real near the Lord. He suffered for the kingdom of Christ's sake. But it wasn't what he had in mind. He wanted to be glorified when he asked that. He wanted to be Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, or something. But he didn't comprehend the nature of the kingdom. And all of these things contribute to what we're talking about tonight and why Jeremiah wept. I think the book of Lamentations can teach us something that is desperately needed. Now let's go back and notice some things about the book. Jeremiah worked 640 BC to 590. And if you know anything about the history chronologically of the Old Testament, Babylonian captivity began in 606 and ended in 536. Those were 70 years of Babylonian captivity. So he began working just before Babylonian captivity and into it. And he had a challenging work, really an almost impossible task. Had it not been for Daniel and Ezekiel and Habakkuk and Zephaniah working with him, and the good King Josiah, 2 Kings 23, starting this spiritual revival or revolution, they would never even preserve a remnant. In Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 20 to 24, the prophet mentions this remnant, just the few that remain loyal to God, that helped preserve Abraham's seed so Christ could come. The others tried to annihilate themselves and leave the promise of a Messiah through Abraham's seed not intact, but vanishing. And so he had terrible work to do, and he was hated by Judah, by the people he's trying to salvage. He was a voice crying in the wilderness. He was often in the dungeon for preaching the truth. And he didn't mind rebuking the king. I want you to listen to this too, and then we'll have more to say about Lamentations itself and Jeremiah as we have time. It's very, very difficult to place yourself in the setting like Jeremiah. He was in and out of the dungeon constantly for telling the truth. And it was the king who should have been a leader of the people, but he was a puppet of the people, that saved him. But it was the king that shoved him back in there when he wouldn't say something flowery that wasn't true to tickle the ears of the king. But did you know from the time they said, give us a king that we may be like the nations round about us in 1 Samuel 8, God allowed them their request, but he sent the prophet to rebuke the king. The prophet was God's mouthpiece. The king was the puppet of the people. Nathan the prophet rebuked David the king, and David admitted, I have sinned, 2 Samuel 12. Isaiah rebuked Hezekiah, 2 Kings 21, and the king knew this prophet had a right to do it. He was God's spokesman. Jeremiah rebuked Jehoiakim and other kings of Judah, and they didn't like it. In fact, in Jeremiah 37:17, a wicked ruler, compromising, no backbone, spineless ruler said, is there any word from the Lord? Jeremiah said, yes, there is, but you're not going to like it. When he told him he didn't like it, and back in the dungeon he went. But it was the king was the people's voice, and the prophet that was God's voice. In fact, the word prophet means protheos, to speak for God to the people. It literally means to bubble forth. Now the abundance of spiritual knowledge, he'd open his mouth and preach to these rulers and their people who were under the thumb of the king, and he didn't mind, without equivocation, rebuking every one of them, the whole lot. So whenever you read about the prophets, they rebuked the king, and the king acknowledged they had a right to. Well, Jeremiah came along with some very sorry kings and just spoke straight up to it. Remember, Jehoiakim read the manuscript denouncing his rule and his kingdom that came from Jeremiah, and he tore it up with a penknife and threw it in the fire, thinking he had destroyed the word of God, Jeremiah chapter 36. But out of the burning embers came the wrath of God twice as strong, and there stood Jeremiah unequivocal, without compromise, sticking with the truth, even though it meant his demise. Reminds me of Micaiah in 1 Kings 22, who defied Ahab and Jezebel. Tough rulers, pagan, idolaters. He said, as the Lord liveth and speaketh unto thee, that will I say. They said, you better change what you're saying, or you're going to go in that dungeon and die, starve to death. And he said, the Lord told me to tell you the truth. And he said, I'm going to add something to that too. The king himself will be destroyed in the battle. You talk about courage. When a false prophet interrupted Jeremiah and said, we won't go into bondage, and if we do, it won't be for 70 years. It'll just be for 2. Jeremiah said, Hananiah, this year you shall die. Jeremiah 28:16, and that year he died. When Belshazzar left to rule Babylon in that drunken brawl, using the vessels Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from the temple back in 2 Kings 25 and 2 Chronicles 36, in the handwriting against the wall, his wise men couldn't touch it. They didn't know anything. They were just yes men. But God's statesman prophet said to that ruler, you've been weighed in the balance and found wanting. The God who made you, him you have not glorified, and your life is taken there. And his life was taken there. Boldness, courage, puppet rulers, sorry people, weaker than branch water, backbone like a jellyfish, no convictions, but the prophet of God stood firm. They threw Daniel in the lion's den, but he wasn't consumed because it was all backbone. And the next day the ruler comes hoping he isn't dead because he knows Daniel's a great man. They'd made the decree you have to bow down to the emperor and worship him. But the minute Daniel heard that, he went to his room, turned his face toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day as he had before. And so that's the setting and the surroundings and the scene of this work right here. Daniel and Ezekiel worked a little bit later than Jeremiah, but in the same time frame. Daniel in the throne room of Babylon and Persia, and Ezekiel out by the river Kibar by the refugees, these ones who had been in captivity in Babylon. So here's your surrounding background to Lamentations, and you see now why the prophet wept. He didn't glory in saying, I told you so. It broke his heart that he had told them and they didn't listen. He was the only one weeping. Abraham wept over Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18. The unrighteous could care less. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. The unrighteous didn't weep. And here is a great man of God weeping over a city, lamenting, shedding tears, and the people themselves who brought this all about We're indifferent to it. In the 50 years I've preached the gospel, and 32 and a half of those years in local congregations, I've noticed that the very people who ought to weep over sin never do. It's the good people, the godly people, the spiritual people that know right from wrong and know the truth that weep over sin, and the sinful folk don't care. In fact, they'll run you off if you let them. A lot of good preachers have been run off by weak, sorry brethren. And there are some sorry preachers ought to be run off, but Jeremiah was valiant, and he had some toughness in his tears, but he had a compassionate heart. And when we rebuke sin, it needs to be with a tear in our eye and a lump in the throat. Not glad we can do it, but sad that it must be done. But we must do it. And to let weak, carnal, worldly, shallow brethren keep us from being God's preacher is a crime against heaven. And it's hard to think of anything worse. Of all the people in whose shoes I wouldn't want to stand the day of judgment, it'd be a man who claimed to be a gospel preacher that had no backbone, or fortitude, or courage, or determination, or conviction. He's going to have a rough time the day of judgment. Lamentation 1:12, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Let's see if we can make application. There's 6 billion people in the world. Millions and millions and millions of those have not heard the name of Christ, have not heard the gospel of Christ. Does that bother us? But let's talk about the thousands of people in the Metroplex area. Draw a big circle that starts, let's say, at Tyler and go all the way to the far side of Fort Worth, then go up to the border of Oklahoma and back down to Waco. Just draw a circle around on that, and you know how many people you got there? About 10 million people. Does it bother us that most of them have never heard of New Testament Christianity? Many of those do not know the Lord. Haven't even gotten started in the direction of Christianity. Does that not bother us? Well, how about, let's narrow it down some more. How about the people who live right around us here? Some of us live in different places around here, but a general area. Does it bother us that many of our neighbors are not Christians? Does it bother us that some brethren have apostatized and others are on the way out? I wish you could have listened to a phone call I got this afternoon. If I identify where this is, it's probably where all your kinfolks are. But just trust me that I wouldn't lie in a Bible study on Wednesday night. Maybe Thursday afternoon, but not Wednesday night. But anyway, here's the way the talk went. He was calling from a congregation of 650 members. We need a new preacher. Our preacher's ill and is going to have to step down. And said, who would you recommend? And then he began to talk. He's related to a fellow I went to college with that I have some esteem for, who's fought some pretty hard battles where he is. But he went on to say, this is going to be a pivotal decision we make when we choose a preacher. He's going to have to be strong. He's going to have to be unbending. He's going to have to preach the truth in love and be kind but firm. And maybe we can salvage something. He said, we've got 2 other people on the payroll that need to leave because they don't do anything. And he said, if you could help send us some real strong preacher, these people would probably be so upset with him for preaching the truth they'd quit. And he said, sure be good if that happened. I'm just telling you the truth, what he said. And he went on to describe the typical large congregation, quote, among us, that hadn't for a long time really stood for anything. Hadn't really been convicting on matters of worldliness and secularism and even denominationalism. And they're surrounded by 1 or 2 large congregations that have already signed out. They're not even trying to be a New Testament church. He said, but we've got enough firepower here and enough members here and enough dedication that we could get the right men here to preach and teach and help stabilize and sustain truth. We could really get something done. I wish I could think of 50 people I could tell him about, but I'd have to struggle a long time to find that many. I'm just telling the truth. When I was growing up, if a man was called a gospel preacher, that always meant the same thing. If a congregation was called the Church of Christ, that always meant the same thing. But we'll be whistling past the graveyard if we say that's true now. And sadly, a lot of people don't care. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? We don't care. A lot of people like a social club where their little toes are never stepped on. And so, is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? In Ezekiel 8:17, he asks the same question a different way. Is it a light thing to you, all you who work abomination? They had their work cut out for them, didn't they? Lamentation 1:12, Ezekiel 8:17. And the people love to have it so. Isaiah 30, verse 10. Paul said, am I your enemy when I tell you the truth? That's a good question, isn't it? Galatians 4:16. Am I striving to please men? If so, I would not be pleasing God. Galatians 1:10. If you strive to be a friend of the world, you yet make yourself an enemy of God. James 4:4. Woe unto you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers under the false prophets. Luke 6:26. And on the Bible goes discussing this very matter. Is it nothing to you, all you who pass by? Paul said, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9:16. For if our gospel be hid, it's hid to them that are lost. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 3. Very little distinctive preaching is done anymore. And men on radio broadcasts and TV opportunities and newspaper articles, we don't have very many that just come out and tell it. There's an old brother named Ramsey Wright who writes a large article about once a month in the Dallas Morning News. It costs him about $4,000 a time. But for about 5 years that I've been noticing, he'll teach more truth in those articles that are important, and they're balanced too, than perhaps all the other newspaper work put together our brethren in the United States will do. I've stayed in touch with him. I'll thank him for his newspaper work, and he'll thank me for TV and radio work. I know he told me, I think he's 91 years old, but a clear mind, and he said, I've been blessed to gather up some money, and I plan to spend it like this. Isn't that amazing that someone still has that concept? And it's old fundamental, backwoodsy preaching right based on the New Testament. It's something to him. He doesn't just walk by. It breaks his heart to see error in and out of the church, but we just need 10,000 more like him. What are we doing to try to stabilize New Testament Christianity? What do we intend to do? Do we just warm benches in church houses? Then we come to chapter 2, verse 16 of Lamentations. He said, the enemies of God are laughing and saying, aha, this is the day we've waited for. And denominational people love to see the church of the Lord in distress. When Billy Saul Estes, who once was a faithful Christian, in fact, I was in 2 meetings in Pecos, Texas, and an elder there with tears streaming down his face said, that's the finest young man that ever came to our town. He was the greatest influence we ever had. I said, when he went bad, he just about killed us. And it was greed and love of money and so forth. And I've even read from his own lips what he said about his decline. But when he went bad, Time Magazine, Newsweek, all the big magazines in America picked up, and they always like to say a deacon, and they'd say lay preacher in the Church of Christ. They couldn't wait to jam that into the paper and make a sneering remark. And when those of us who are supposed to be faithful Christians go astray, the old devil and his worldlings are sitting back applauding. They love to see it. They're laughing out loud. This is the day we've waited for. And when a preacher goes bad through immorality or doesn't pay his bills, that reflects on the whole church, not only in his town, but everywhere else. We're going to have to scrutinize and analyze our own lives and our own people. And we're going to have to raise up a generation of brethren who are honorable and honest and pay their debts and aren't a bunch of leeches on society. The Bible still says if a man will not work, neither let him eat. 2 Thessalonians 3, verse 10 and 12. And so people who are lazy and indifferent to their responsibilities, I think I mentioned this before, but my dad had this philosophy. Of course, I grew up in the Depression, and it's hard to find a job. But as the Depression started waning a little and the economy got a little better, my dad's philosophy was, son, if there's an open job in Grayson County, you go get it. He really was serious about that too. We need the financial help, and you need to not grow up being lazy. I was the janitor of a 2-room country schoolhouse, made $2.84 every 2 weeks. That's a lot of money back in 1941, too. Neighbor across the highway there from where we lived out in the country said, I'll give you $5 if you chop down all my weeds out here. I thought $5 was about as much as a fella could earn in a lifetime. And I got me one of those little yo-yo sickle deals, you know. When I got through, all the flesh on both hands, and I just bleeding like everything. That $5 was well earned. But that's the way we grew up. Not a lazy bone in your body if you wanted to eat supper there at his table. And that wasn't bad, that was good. But now we spoil and pet and pamper, and kids grow up thinking the world and the church and everybody else owes them a living, and they don't owe anybody anything. Just won't work. And that's what causes the enemies of God to laugh and say, this is the day we waited for. So we should never, ever engage in anything that would cause enemies of truth to laugh at us. We need to be careful and analyze and scrutinize ourselves with introspective, honest look at self. And be sure we're not the kind of member of the church that causes the people to taunt and laugh at the body of Christ. Well, what do we do about it? Let us search and try our ways and turn again to Jehovah. Let us lift up our hearts with our hands unto God in heaven. We've got to be honest when we look at self. Am I lazy? Am I indifferent? Am I uncaring? Didn't bother me that souls are lost? How does Lamentations fit in my life? Every time I teach this book, along with Jeremiah in the School of Preaching, I go to the board and we usually start with Lamentations and then go to Jeremiah. Some think that's in reverse, but I believe you get to see the man Jeremiah in the book of Lamentations. If anything, it's an introduction to the 52 chapters of Jeremiah. But he was really one of these introspective, honest fellows. And I make the point that if we're not willing to really see ourselves as we are, we can deceive ourselves, and self-deception is the worst deception of all. It's very easy to think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think, and not to really be honest. O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself, is not a man that walketh to direct his own steps. Jeremiah 10:23. Every way of man is right in his own eyes. Proverbs 21:2. There is a way that seemeth right unto a man, but the end thereof are the ways of death. Proverbs 14:12. You shall not do after all the things we do here this day. Every man that which is right in his own eyes. Deuteronomy 12:8. Not he that commendeth himself is approved before God, but whom the Lord commendeth. 2 Corinthians 10:18. Examine yourselves whether you be in the faith. 2 Corinthians 13:5. Our sufficiency is not of ourselves, but of God. 2 Corinthians 3:5. But to be willing and able to honestly see ourselves as, number one, the Lord sees us, and as others do, is not an easy task. We like to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to, Romans 12:10 and following. And so that introspective look of Lamentation 3:40 and 41 is an absolute essential thing. But then he said, those who were raised in scarlet have wound up in a garbage dump. In Philippians 3, Paul said, I have to give up everything in my past and count them as dung, refuge, garbage, and put my trust in God that I might know Christ. Philippians 3:4 through 11. And the only way that we'll really reflect in our life what the mirror of the soul, the Word of God teaches, James chapter 1, is to approach it honestly and humbly and reverently with meekness. And that isn't easy to do. Those are words that we don't like to apply to ourselves. This is a great and rich book. But every time I teach this, I go to the board and I put a list of words that describe what sin is and what it does, and each one of them begins with the letter P. Sin is pitiful. Sin is putrid. Sin is pathetic. Sin is personal. Sin is progressive. The first Psalm says the man who walks with sin, stands with sin, and then sits down with sin, progresses in the life of sin. And that's what happened to David with Bathsheba and Uriah that ruined him and his family. 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. He just step by step went further and further into the dregs of sin. Wound up in the quicksand and quagmire of evil. And that's the way it works. And we do reap what we sow, and when we sow the flesh, we shall of the flesh reap corruption. Galatians 6, 7, and 8. Again, we will reap what we sowed. We may reap more than we sowed. We may reap later than we sowed, but we'll always reap what we sowed. And David's life is an example of that. You can't sow your wild oats all week and come pray for a crop failure on Sunday morning. It just doesn't work that way. So sin is pervasive. There's so many words, you need to look up something. It is popular. It is punished. It is personal. It is public. And those are just some of the words. I think I've gathered up about 25 of them. You were raised in the scarlet, you wound up in the garbage dump. And then we come to chapter 5, verse 7. Our fathers have sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. The Bible doesn't teach I inherit the sins of my parents. The soul that sinneth, it shall surely die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither the father bear the iniquity of the son. But many times the way we're raised and trained and taught by lip and life will reproduce in our life. For instance, Stephen's parting words before they stoned him to death, Acts 7:51, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised and hardened ears, as your fathers did, even so do ye, always resisting the Holy Spirit. They were guilty of the same thing that ruined their fathers. So the Bible teaches if we're not careful, we will proceed in the lifestyle we came across or inherited, but will not be guilty of the sins of our parents, but we will reap the sad dividends of the consequences of their sins. But the verse that really sums this up accurately is Jeremiah 3:25. We lie down in our shame and our confusion covers us, for we have sinned against God, we and our fathers from a youth even unto this day, and have not obeyed the voice of the Lord our God. We're guilty of doing the same things our parents did, he's saying. We learned better, we knew better, we should have done better. These are great and brilliant chapters in the Old Testament. We just need to be more acquainted with them. In Jeremiah 17:1, he said, write the sin of Judah with an indelible pen. Jeremiah 51:5, he said, the whole land is full of sin. How would you like to be the prophet, the preacher, the teacher in a time like that? We probably have come full circle to another time like that. I recommend to you that you read the book of Lamentations and then get ready to study this man Jeremiah, one of God's greatest, grandest, finest, most eloquent, down-to-earth country prophets that you'll ever see. He's my favorite of all the prophets. And I think that it is worth noting that when Jesus asked, whom do men say that I am? People who really didn't know who he was likened him to Jeremiah. What a compliment to Jeremiah. You're like Jeremiah. You're Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. Bold, straightforward, unbending, uncompromising. I really commend to you Jeremiah and Lamentations as books that are worthy of study. I want to mention one last thing that's interesting. Wayne Jackson, who's one of the greatest writers we have, wrote a book about 2 or 3 years ago on Jeremiah and Lamentations, and he dedicated it to me. I was never so surprised. I got this in the mail, and he had a little yellow arrow pointing down to the inside page, and opened it and said, this is dedicated to my good friend Johnny Ramsey, who 25 years ago introduced me to the joys and the study of the book of Jeremiah. It was really one of the nicest things anyone said. I kidded him when I saw him. I said, the only trouble is I bought 4,000 copies of that book. But I'm glad that if I had any help for him in getting him more acquainted with these books, that's good for everybody. And his little book is really great. You've listened well, and from time to time when I'm able to be here on Wednesday nights, I will study with you things that are usually not studied, and things that might help us during the week to get our heads and hearts back in the book more. We appreciate this opportunity.